Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue straight on till morning. The desert. No, Wendy said softly. Even when she had predicted it, even though now she could see the truth in her own eyes, she still felt down in the long tunnel of childishness, wishing that just what had happened hadn't. Denying with her full being that the vase had tipped and smashed, and the terrible thing just had come out of her own mouth, that the souffle had fallen moments before she served it to mother and father. That she and Tinkerbell were stranded, cut off from the rest of Neverland, in what looked like an infinite desert. Wendy carefully stepped back to the point she had marked before, knowing full well it might be important later. 3 red stones, increasing size, were lined up like a fallen desert sandman. A scrubbly little black and mackey turquoise bush with 2 pom-pom-like appendages grew nearby. There were footprints coming out of nowhere. Beginning the journey, she bent over, trying to pick up a hit of moist air, of cool sea breeze, of pungent jungle funk. But of course there was nothing. Tinkerbell zipped around and forth above Wendy, trying to see what she was seeing. Then she flew a little farther out, to the left and right and front and back with the neat, almost unnatural motions of a dragonfly hunting. Actually, she was hunting for a way out. Anything? Wendy asked, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. Tinkerbell shrugged and shook her head and jingled sadly. Maybe. Look, I know you don't want to disrespect this place, but the first seemed to abandon us to our fates. For now. Maybe it would be alright if you just flew up really high in the air and looked around. Tinkerbell nodded reluctantly. She took a big, dramatic breath and rose into a pale sky. Wendy had to shade her eyes with her hand to see the fairy at all against the brightness. Higher, higher, higher still than a kite. Eventually, she just disappeared. While Wendy knew her friend's invisibility was just the trick of distance and limitation of her own eyesight, she couldn't help but fretting. She shuffled her feet and bit her lip until the fairy reappeared, falling down on the exact same path she had taken up to the inevitability and determination of an acorn free from its twig. Wendy held out her hand and the tiny girl landed on it with obvious gratitude. Anything? Tinkerbell shook her head, looked perplexed. She pointed north, east, south, west, or whatever passed for them in this strange land. She put a hand to her head, much like Wendy when watching for her, and mimed looking out far in each direction, frowning and squinting. She shrugged again. It just goes on and on and on in every direction. Forever, just that big muddy plateau in front of us. That's the only future in any distance. But we saw boundaries when we flew down, Wendy protested, not arguing with a friend so much as with reality. It wasn't so big, this area. It only covered a tiny portion of this island. Tinkerbell gave her a look. All right, I know we're not dealing with normal forces here, Wendy sighed. After telling us that we need to save Neverland, and soon, the first abandoned and trapped here, only one can assume that we think we can find their way out. It's just sort of like a test. So let's think about this logically. Their destiny seems to continue forever. It's all outside beyond us. But where did the first go? I didn't see any of those monoliths. Or I guess you would see mud piles in any direction far away from us. They are only in the middle distance, so perhaps there is someplace inward to go. Or downward. Yes, perhaps backward and Neverlandy. What do you think, Tinkerbell? The fairy shrugged and nodded, pursing her lips, like, sure, sounds as good as anything at this point. All right, Len, well, let's head over to the cliffs there. Maybe there's a secret canyon that burrows deep into the lair. Race you. Wendy raised her arms to fly. Nothing happened. Up now, happy thoughts. Her feet remained firmly planted on the ground. Tinkerbell frowned. Oh dear, Wendy said. The fairy spiraled up and down across the human girl, practically smothering her in fairy dust. Much of it was blown away on the harsh, hot breeze. Thousands of sparkles speeding across the arid landscape in a cloud that grew taller and taller and more spread out as it dissipated in the air. What a waste, Wendy sighed. She thought of all good things. Candy floss, the first scent of lilacs in the spring, a really nice day in the shade of the backward tree with her notebook, Nana under her hand. Still nothing happened. Either I'm terrified to the core of my soul by this place, Wendy said thoughtfully, or I can't borrow your fairy magic here. Tinkerbell shook her head sorrowfully and patted her on the head. Well, then onward anyway. Wendy straightened her back, gave Tinkerbell and herself a reassuring nod, and began marching towards the cliff. That's what Englishmen did. They pushed up their sleeves, gritted their teeth, and did what had to be done. Out in the midday sun, if needed to be, like mad dogs. And so was she. It was hard going to the strange sand. There were occasional patches of slick white rock, flat as a tabletop and much easier to walk on. But these didn't always line up with the way she was heading. Often she had to walk along until its end and then stumble in the sand until the next one. Any plant she accidentally dragged her legs against the left scrapes of both kinds. Harmless little white line reminders and truly defensive strikes. Deep angry welts. Wendy was sweating profusely. Now it's evaporated immediately in the air. This caused her some confusion until she finally figured out where some potential rivulets of sweat were disappearing to, which brought up another worry. In her stories, dehydration was much less threatening, and they couldn't find water anywhere on the desert island, not even in the coconut palm to climb and crack the fruits thereof and drink the sweet nectar. Also, the heroes wondered and thirsted and dreamed of lemonade. And of course, Peter Pan and the Lost Boys had eventually found something like a washed-up cask of cider or a hidden spring. Here there was no stress at all, and it seemed very unlikely without Moses to find a spring in the middle of the desert. Lack of water was going to be a real problem, real soon, not to mention hunger. She looked askance at her friend, who was flying beside her with an equal look of determination. Her teensy brow was a little dewy and covered with dust. It didn't seem like she was in any real discomfort. It was hard to tell if time passed at all away in the strange land. These cliffs and mazes did seem to grow closer, very slowly, but the light didn't change at all. Wendy noticed with fascination that the shadows of this land chose their angle and size with no particular logic. A stone might have a long shadow lying in the area she thought of as east, as if the sun were setting somewhere to the west, while the bush next to it might have been a barely there black circle clinging to its twiggy skirts like it was high noon. Perhaps that was why Peter was drawn here. The first might have had some sort of strange affinity to shadows and shadow magic. Tinkerbell's shadow yawned and stretched and pointed here and there, but honestly, the little fairy moved too quickly for herself for the difference between them to be noticeable. Unlike Wendy's lack of shadow, which was very noticeable, the ground looked bleak and empty beneath her. She found that even she missed the shadows not quite appropriate behavior, like when she grew distracted and did something Wendy wasn't doing. She wondered if the shadow was out looking for Peter. Did she also go weak without contact with her mistress? Did she need Wendy? And once they found Peter and reunited with his shadow, would her shadow follow suit? Or would her shadow prefer to stay in Neverland, where she was free to do as she pleased, rather than return to London and a life of just copying Wendy's every movement? Would Wendy be able to go home without her? She found herself missing deeply the cold and wet weather of that city. It was vastly preferable to the oven they were in now. Minutes or hours passed. Wendy fretted and swore quietly to herself. Time was ticking away, and there was no closer to stopping Hook, and his nefarious plans now confirmed by the first. What sort of lunatic destroys everything when he can't win? She growled. Perhaps it was her fault as a storyteller. Perhaps recurring villains grew sick of their own reoccurrence. Wendy tried not to brush back her hair that wound up in her eyes because she would get red streaks from the eucalyptus dust in it and all over her face. Tinkerbell had plucked a tiny, thick leaf and tried to hold it as an umbrella above her head, perhaps to keep herself dry whenever the landscape was doing in her vision. But no matter which way she tilted, it seemed unsatisfied with the results. Eventually she let it drop, but only after taking a tentative bite out of its flesh. The look on her face was all that she needed to stop Wendy from launching into a lecture on the danger of known plants and their possible toxicity. The fairy wasted precarious spit going all of it and the taste out of her mouth. Finally, they arrived at the skirts of the red cliffs. Here, giant slopes of rock that looked like they used to be part of the mountains finally succumbed to time and melted into piles of sand and rubble. Among their folds were multiple canyons, twisting and leading into the deep plateau. Wendy picked a likely one and pointed. Tinkerbell nodded. They plunged ahead. "So, Tinkerbell," Wendy ventured after they walked for a bit, your fairy friends back there, what were their names?" "Barry, Loon, and Thorn." "Thorn, yes, that suits the fellow quite well. Thorn, like with his sword stabbing." Tinkerbell narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Wendy slipped down a treacherous path of slick rock covered in fine gravel. Much more of her skirt tore. Without even thinking this time, she simply ripped off the ragged piece and tied it around her middle like a belt. "Cuts like quite a figure, doesn't he? I mean, his apparel was quite immodest, but he wore it well, didn't he?" Tinkerbell buzzed over to hang in Wendy's face. "Oh my flocks, you like him." "Like?" Wendy said indignantly. "I hardly know the boy. I was just saying how handsome he was, and well spoken, and his ears were very elegant." "You like Thorn." Whatever the fairy was saying from then on grew incomprehensible as she laughed into the great peals of jiggly laughter that echoed off the canyon walls. She actually held her belly and guffawed, wasting quantities of sparkly lead of fairy dust on sand below. This only irritated Wendy further. She had just grown used to flying and was now more than a little peeved that her power was gone. All right, no need to be all gossipy and schoolgirlish about it. It's just Thorn. He's so dull, and you're so big." "I was only making conversation," Wendy said grumpily. "Oh, I'm just teasing," the little fairy said, patting her eyes wide, patting her eyes wide with mock apology. "When we get out of here and rescue Peter's shadow, we can find him to the fairy realm so you can tell me your true feelings. Or I will if you can't." "Don't you dare!" Wendy cried. Tinkerbell wiped a tear of laughter out of her eye. "Kidding. I wouldn't unless you asked me to. It's just so weird." "I don't see why it's strange. But let me make sure I get clear about this so you don't get in trouble. You don't, like him?" Tinkerbell made a face. Then she thought about it. Really thought about it. Then she shrugged. "Nope. You only have eye for Peter Pan, don't you?" Wendy said softly. Tinkerbell nodded woefully. "All right, we're not going to discuss him, but what about the other girl? Barry Loon or whatever. She acted like she knew you very well. Are you friends?" I'm going to stop it right there, and I will continue later. Bye.